how the market had changed so much in June, and I never got a chance to ask you what that change was. But okay, now I'm going to do it. How is the market different now than prior to June, and what was that change all about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the market from basically from June 2020 up until June of 2022.
It's John Brodeen, the one, the only. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm good. How about you, John?
I'm doing good. I'm glad it's Friday.
Yep.
You have big plans for the weekend?
I don't think we got much going on. I think we're going to go out and do dinner on Saturday. No, we had a lot of stuff going on last weekend. So
yeah, I'm supposed to be taking off for ice fishing here in a couple hours.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah, I'm hoping. Lake of the Woods, going up to Artisans. There's your little plug, Artisans Rocky Point.
There you go.
And I'm looking forward to it because usually when I bring nice fresh walleye home up from Lake of the Woods, it only costs me about $120 a pound. So you know how that goes by the time beer and all that stuff. There was something I wanted to ask you when you were in on Wednesday, John. You had mentioned it a couple of times how the market had changed so much in June, and I never got a chance to ask you what that change was. But okay, now I'm going to do it. How is the market different now than prior to June? And what was that change all about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the market from basically from June 2020 up until June of 2022 was crazy hot. Very, very low inventory. It's like inventory fell off. People weren't listing their homes when everybody was kind of in lockdown mode from COVID. And then when things started people started getting the itch to get out and move again, then it kind of went crazy. Tons of people looking to buy homes. Interest rates were extremely low, and there were not very many homes on the market. And it's like inventory never caught up to the number of homes that were selling. So we were in this low inventory, high buyer activity market basically for 2 years, where values went up substantially over those 2 years. Everything that was half decent, didn't even have to be an amazing house, was getting multiple offers, selling over asking price, just because there were so many buyers out there for every single one listing that was on the market. So this continued, and it continued into early 2022. The spring market in early 2022 was still really hot, despite interest rates beginning to rise. And then the interest rates really started to get to a point that made a lot of buyers want to put a hold on their home search around that June time. And that's also so you get there's a time in the early spring where the number of active listings hasn't quite caught up to the buyer activity. Usually that's in like late March throughout April. And this is why that's usually the hottest time, like the hottest sellers market of the year, every year. It's kind of a seasonal thing. And then there's the listings that didn't get sold during that time, and a lot more listings hitting the market, where inventory usually kind of becomes a little bit higher in the summertime. There's still a lot of buyer activity going through. So we saw the inventory rise quite a bit around June. It got higher than it's gotten in the past couple of years, if I remember right.
Because it seems to me, I recall, especially during the COVID thing when the interest rates were down, so was the inventory.
Yes.
And I figured they had to be related. It kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and that was kind of a weird phenomenon because it was like there was a third of the number of listings that were typically on the market during that time.
Sure.
And then the interest rates started going up, the buyer activity started going down, and the number of listings started rising, and that really balanced out the market more. So after June, listings were taking longer to sell. They weren't getting bombarded with multiple offers on every single nice listing. So things were taking longer to sell. You weren't having all these record-setting prices anymore. I always keep this in mind when I'm running comps on a listing that I'm going to be putting up and I'm trying to price it, because I pay attention to whether the comp sold before or after June.
Okay.
Because if it sold before June, it might be hard to reach that same number now that we're in a more balanced market. And it's still technically a seller's market. It's just much closer to the balance point than it was before June.
Okay.
So that's when, and then, interest rates fluctuated a little bit. They'd get even higher, and that would cause kind of a temporary slowdown, and then they'd drop a little bit, and we'd see more people deciding to pull the trigger, and then they'd rise again, and you'd see a little. So it's like the rising interest rates coupled with prices being higher than from the fast appreciation in the past couple of years, it did price some buyers out of the market.
Okay.
And some buyers, they decided, they want to wait until interest rates get low again, because you know, it's kind of like that acceleration effect.
Yeah.
Where, you know, when you're going 100 miles an hour and then you slow down to 50 miles an hour, it feels like you're barely moving.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's like when everybody's used to these interest rates that are 3% or less, all of a sudden we go back up to 5%, all of a sudden, and 6%. It seems like that's just gone through the roof.
Yeah,
When in
yeah, people are freaking out.
Yeah, historically, you know, it's like it's really not crazy high.
No,
interest
it's
rates,
not.
but-
And you mentioned the word historically. Historically, can you ever remember interest rates being as low as they were?
Oh yeah, and I don't know if it'll ever happen again.
Right,
because-
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
This could have been a once in a lifetime thing.
Yes.
But would you consider the interest rates now high or more back to normal-ish?
pretty normal. I mean, rates in what we had gotten used to, like, so I started real estate in 2014.
Okay.
What's normal to me is kind of like mid fours. So it's a little higher than normal, but not much. When you compare, 6% interest to, 2.875, obviously
Yeah.
the payment's much higher now than it
Right.
would have been at 2.875. And the reason the interest rates were so low, a lot of people don't realize this, is the country went into a recession for a very short period of time at the beginning of COVID because, economically everything just slowed
Country
to a
shut
stop.
down, yeah.
And what they didn't want to happen is they didn't want us to plummet into some sort of serious recession or depression or whatever. And one of the tools they have in their toolbox is is called quantitative easing. That's when the government is buying more mortgage-backed securities, which is going to push down interest rates because the government doesn't demand as high of a return. Basically, those mortgage-backed securities don't have to pay as well because the government's buying them all anyway.
Okay.
And it's fewer private investors buying those mortgage-backed securities. And that's one of the tools the government has in their toolbox to stimulate the economy, which they did at that point. So that's why those interest rates got so low. And it somewhat contributed to, the inflation that we're seeing now and have been seeing over the past couple of years. So then the government decided that one of the ways they can, and obviously the inflation was contributed to by supply chain issues. That's another major factor, and stuff with gas prices, all that kind of stuff.
Everything.
Other factors, not just real estate.
Right.
One of the tools that the government has to slow down inflation is the opposite of quantitative easing. So like we said, quantitative easing is buying more of those mortgage-backed securities. Quantitative tightening is when they buy less of those mortgage-backed securities. When the government starts buying less of those mortgage-backed securities, then it matters more how much those mortgage-backed securities are paying out because it's private investors that are buying them. A larger percentage of them are being bought by private investors, not the federal government. So those people are more picky about the returns they're getting. There's less of them being bought, so they have to be more attractive, so they need to pay out more. So that's what happens when the government does quantitative tightening and reduces the number of mortgage-backed securities that they're buying. In turn, then these mortgage interest rates have to be higher. So the common misconception is that the Fed rates, that's like overnight money. The Fed rate is not the Fed changing the interest, or the Fed rate does not change the mortgage interest rates. They are somewhat related, but the Fed rate does not directly control mortgage interest rates. Mortgage interest rates are controlled by supply and demand in the mortgage-backed securities. So
I just learned something new again.
yes,
Okay.
Yes. So two different things. And so that's what they started doing at the beginning of 2022 is quantitative tightening, buying fewer mortgage-backed securities, driving the interest rates up because less of them are being bought, so they need to be more attractive and they need to pay out more. So that's what we're kind of in right now. And I honestly, in my opinion, they probably could have started doing that earlier. They were a little bit late to the party. What you do not want to do is you don't want to raise rates, and you don't want to raise rates too slowly, because what'll happen then is the worst possible case scenario is you're in an environment where you have high interest rates and high inflation at the same time, because then you don't really have that tool available anymore to try to control inflation. You've used it, but you used it too slowly and it didn't make a difference. So they do need to hit hard and fast when they raise interest rates to try to control inflation, which is what they did. And obviously some of it's not controlled by interest rates. Some of it's the supply and demand stuff.
Sure. All right. We talk about supply and demand, interest rates versus inventory, inflation, quantitative tightening, all of this stuff. Is it a good time to buy and sell?
Yes. So the thing that people people pay so much attention to the interest rates, whether it's a good time to buy and sell. What they don't realize is that it's temporary.
Right.
Rates could go up from now, and that would have meant that you locked in at the best possible time if you locked in right now, because if in 6 months they're at 8%, you got in 2% lower than where they are in the future.
Okay.
And then on the flip side of the coin, if rates are at 4% in 2 months, which they won't be, but if they were, it doesn't mean it's a bad time to buy right now. It just means that you'd refi in 2 months when rates hit 4%, and then you'd be able to, once they're at 4%, then you'd be able to lock in a much lower interest rate. So it's not a permanent thing. I think whether it's a good time or not to buy depends on whether you can afford the payment on the house you're getting into, if you're able to get the type of house you need at that payment. And it's more life circumstances that determine whether it's a good time to buy or sell. The main thing is when you're in the real estate market and you own the home that you're living in, making sure you can stay in it for the long term. I've said that. I probably say that in some way or another on every single podcast.
Right.
It's not a get in when it's hot and then get out before it gets cold. It's a long-term thing. You got to pay to put a roof over your head, one way or another.
So, we kind of started off the show, John, with how the market is different now than prior to June. We had talked about that earlier in the week. So the market now compared to prior to June, good, bad, the same?
Well, it's less of a hot market. We're not seeing the fast appreciation. So it depends on which side of the transaction you're on.
Okay.
If you're a seller, it's not as great of a market as it was back before June. If you're a buyer, it's a much better market than it was before June. If you're somebody who needs to sell and buy, it honestly doesn't make that much of a difference, because back then it'd honestly be a little easier right now, because in a little more balanced market, you're still going to be able to sell your home in a reasonable amount of time. And you're actually going to have options when you're looking for the new home you're going to get into.
Oh.
Before June, if you're somebody who's staying in Grand Forks, you need to buy and you need to sell the home you're in right now, the issue you would have run into before June is it would have been very hard to find the type of home that you need. And you probably would have gotten outbid on a bunch of different bidding wars. You probably would have had to pay absolute top dollar for it. You might not have gotten everything you needed and wanted in a home just because there were so few options and competition was so high. You also would have absolutely crushed it on the sale of your home.
Oh, yeah.
So it all depends what side of the transaction you're on. And there's so many people that are on both sides of the transaction simultaneously that you can't just say, oh, the market was better then than it is now, and it's better now than it was then, or whatever. So the months of December and January were quite slow this year. They were slower than they usually are, and that's going by the number of sales that went through. The number of active inventory is also back down very, very low, which is good, because you'd be in a super extreme buyer's market right now with such slow activity if we had high number of active listings on the market. So things are staying pretty balanced, pretty steady. It's a healthy market in general right now.
We were talking about this too the other day. I'd learned more again today.
Good. Yeah.
You're like, good. Sometimes I feel like, and I'm like, no, man, I go almost every time you guys are in here, I learned something new. And I learned something new again today. John, have yourself a great weekend. If somebody wants to get a hold of realty expert John Brodin, how do they do that?
Yeah, go ahead and subscribe to me on YouTube. Turn on post notifications so you can see whenever I come up with a new video. Subscribe to me follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, my business page, all those different platforms. LinkedIn, I'm posting content daily. And if you want to become a client, get a hold of me. My cell phone number is 701-213-5428, and you can send me a text on there whenever you want.
Have yourself a great weekend, my friend.
You too, John.
All right, and we'll see you probably in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
All right, there you go for the week. Your Berkshire Hathaway bi-weekly podcast with realty expert John Brodin for the studios of Grand Forks Best Source. And I tell you what, everybody, have yourself a great weekend.